Hi, everybody. I'm Father Jonathan from Church of the Ascension. I thought that during this season when we can't really gather together, that I would record a kind of periodic reflection on a passage of scripture that's been really meaningful to me, or quote that's been really meaningful to me, or a commemoration maybe that's been in the daily office lectionary, something like that. And just to kind of post these as a way to encourage us all and also to kind of remain connected during this season. So a lot of us are feeling a lot of anxiety right now. I've talked to many who are finding themselves out of work, and we can't gather or travel, and it turns out that most of our economy hinges upon free movement and gatherings of various sorts. And maybe right now you're feeling scared about how you're going to put food on the table or how you're going to make rent. And if you have kids, they're at home and you're suddenly responsible for their education in a way that you never have been before. I mean, that's what's going on in my world. If you're single, things are silent and still, and maybe perhaps pretty lonely. Almost everyone is scared about what this coronavirus means for our society, for our economy, for our own health and the health of those that we love. So what do we do with all of this anxiety? I thought we would turn today to Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, in which St. Paul tells us something that we can do when we feel anxious. He says there in that passage, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." So it's this common refrain in Scripture to not be anxious, to not be afraid. Why is this repeated over and over again in Scripture? It's because the world we live in is a very scary place, and it always has been. It's a place where we experience immense vulnerability, where everything and everyone we love lives under constant threat. Sometimes philosophers will describe the difference between fear and anxiety as a difference between something particular and something general. Fear is quite specific usually. I'm afraid of the lion that's advancing upon me, looking very hungry and growling. I'm afraid because the person I sat next to on the bus last week was sweating and coughing, and I'm afraid they're going to transmit the coronavirus to me. But anxiety is more generalized and nonspecific. And so therefore, it's actually somewhat harder to deal with. It's somewhat more difficult to get your mind around. I'm anxious maybe that the bottom will drop out of the economy and I won't be able to make money and then I'll become homeless. I'm anxious thinking about all the different possible threats that could befall my children, and I imagine 20 horrific scenarios that would be the end of life as I know it. All of these anxious scenarios make me feel desolate and desperate, vulnerable, maybe even panicked. All of them involve actually imagining a world in which we are left completely on our own and to our own resources to defend for ourselves. And that's why I think Andy Crouch in a recent essay wrote that the best definition I've ever heard of anxiety is imagining the future without Jesus in it. I think that's incredibly helpful language because it actually takes us into the heart of this passage. St. Paul knows what this anxiety is, and so he gives us his counsel here, which is close to the heart of what it means to live an authentically Christian existence. To give the command to be anxious for nothing already acknowledges that we feel anxious. The Christian life is distinguished from other ways of life not by the absence of these disturbing feelings, but by what we do when we experience those feelings. St. Paul says that the moment that these feelings descend upon us, the great power of Christianity is that we don't have to be enslaved to them. We do not have to be paralyzed by them. We have a pathway through which to negotiate anxiety. And that pathway is to make our requests known to God in three ways: through prayer, through supplication, and through thanksgiving. For Paul, these three things are somewhat like reflex actions in the face of anxiety. The moment we experience anxiety, this is how we are meant to respond. So what are these three things? First, prayer. Prayer simply names the act in Scripture of calling upon the name of the Lord. That's how sometimes Scripture describes what prayer is. So to pray is to break out of the illusion of a secular world in which the only forces that are in play are nature red in tooth and claw, and human beings who are part of nature, but the only part of nature that's miserably conscious of its own impending mortality, and who struggle futilely to impose order and stability upon the world. It's to intentionally confess that actually those aren't the only forces in nature, that God is the creator, and that he is the power that sustains the world and permeates the world in such a way that he is closer to us, more intimate to us than our most interior parts, as St. Augustine powerfully put it in his Confessions. The great 20th century theologian Jean Danielou said that at the heart of all prayer is an act or a confession of adoration. It's to mentally and emotionally stop imagining ourselves as the center of the cosmos and to acknowledge God instead to be the center of the world. But in so doing, actually, that act of the act of adoration or the confession of adoration is actually the moment in which we are liberated from the suffocating materialism of secularity. Prayer is, Jean Danielou says, the struggle to save man from asphyxiation, the asphyxiation of a kind of materialism that's curved in on itself. Now, if prayer is to intentionally confess that God is in command of the world and to refuse the secular vision of the world, then supplication is to address God directly and to make our requests known to him. It's to acknowledge in that moment that we are finite, we are limited, we are vulnerable, and that our control is much more illusory and limited than we think it is, and far more robustly limited than we are relentlessly told day after day that it is. The greatest heresy in America is Pelagianism. Pelagianism is, to put it simply, the belief that you are able to secure your own salvation and your own deliverance. But all of us know deep down that this is just factually inaccurate. We are in charge of so very little. And black swan events like this coronavirus often draw into sharp relief what is always true about our lives. We rely on God at every moment for our next sustaining breath. And therefore, to call out to him in supplication is to voice our anxiety to him and to request help in our present moment and help not to worry for the future, but to live in this moment with faithfulness, with diligence, and with cheerfulness. And so I think that's why actually St. Paul adds to this list thanksgiving. Because if you're going to live in this moment with faithfulness, with diligence, and with cheerfulness, there's really only one way to do that. It's to notice not just the overwhelming, swirling chaos around you, but the little gifts that the day offers up to you. If we fail to notice the gifts, we actually fail to reckon with God's very practical and concrete provision for us. To notice these little gifts throughout the day is how people all over the world for millennia have lived in very painful and straitened and vulnerable circumstances and yet have been full of the most radiant joy. And it's also why people who live in societies of abundance like ours are so often very unhappy. So right now, I'd like to just take a moment for us to engage in an exercise. I would like for us to spend just a moment searching ourselves. In this moment, I'd like for you to just ask briefly, what are you afraid of? What are you anxious about? Close your eyes and be silent for just a moment as we consider that question. And now pray. Call upon the name of the Lord. Let him know what you're anxious about. Now also call to mind something that you noticed today that you can be grateful for. What is the gift in today that you can be grateful to God for? This little exercise that Paul commends to us can become a habit if we practice it each and every time that we find ourselves anxious. And if we do it, if it becomes a habit, if it becomes a disposition where when we experience these distressing emotions, we immediately turn to this exercise, we'll find, I think, the strength that St. Paul found in order to live faithfully in this moment in joyful dependence upon God.